All right. Hi, everybody. Just wanted to make you aware, although I'm sure you're already at least somewhat aware of this, that your first assignment of Unit 3 is available to you. It's called Tech Jobs Console, and it is due 1 week from today, I believe, next Thursday. It's gonna cover the introductory Java stuff that we talked about in class on Monday, and that we're gonna continue talking about in class today. As far as the schedule goes, we're gonna kind of continue talking about these introductory Java topics for a little while longer, at least into next week, and then we're gonna start hopping into building web apps with Java around week 3 or so, if I remember correctly. But for today, we're still gonna kind of make our continue our transition from Python into Java. And we're going to talk about some important constructs, some things that we've already seen before. They just look a little bit different now. So let's have a chat about loops. We've been using loops for many, many weeks. They're not mysterious to us anymore, but they look a little bit different in Java. They behave a little bit different in Java. How? Can somebody give me some differences between loops in Python and loops in Java? Anybody? Yeah.
In Java, you have to wrap the conditional in a set of parentheses.
The conditional, so what kind of loop are we talking about?
So I guess in this case, it would be a while.
A while loop. So we've got two different kinds of loops, right? While loops and for loops, and Java can do both of those kinds as well, like Python can do. And so the while loop, I want to say, is probably the most similar between the two. It has a conditional, as you mentioned. Java requires that we put it in parentheses. Anything else between while loops that looks a little different? Something we talked about last time. The curly braces to indicate where the loop starts and ends. Other than that, they look and feel very similar. For loops, on the other hand, are kind of a different animal in Java, right? What does a for loop in Java expect from you? What are the pieces of information that a Java for loop is going to be looking for? There's a few things that I'm thinking of. Start, stop, and step. So we have, so start, stop, and step all refer to a single value that we would call a loop variable, right? And so what do I want this loop variable to start? When do I want this loop variable to stop? And how do I want it to change in between? Those are the three pieces that a for loop is expecting to get from you. This differs pretty significantly from what we would see in Python. In Python, we would see for I in range, and then range would kind of implicitly tell us the start and the stop and the step, right? The beginning number, the ending number, and then how much gap in between. That wasn't the only way that we've seen for loops though, right? There's another way in Python that we used for loops. Yeah. Yeah, we can iterate through stuff that's in a list. Can Java do that? Yes, it can. What does that look like? There's a colon involved, yeah. For something, colon, and then a collection, a list. We're going to talk about Arraylist here in just a second, so that would be one thing that you could use in that particular case. So just like we saw in Python, right, I can have an index that counts. Java can do that too. Or I can have a loop that iterates through every single item of a list. Java can do that as well. I've got a little exercise coming up here in a few minutes, and we might see those two different kinds of loops in action in Java. Any questions or other things that you want to talk about in regards to loops before we hop to the next one? All right, let's talk about if statements. So if statements in Java and Python, what are some of the differences you expect to see between those two structures? Parentheses, so we got parentheses again, just like a while loop, right? That's really about it. We got the curly braces again, and that's really about it. I can still do else ifs, correct? They look a little bit different. I actually say the entire word else if instead of elif, right? But otherwise, they feel very similar to each other, and that's a good thing. They do more or less the same thing, behave in basically the same way. The syntax is just a little bit different between the two languages. Any questions about that before we talk about some other stuff? All right, let's move on to a couple of data types then, a couple of data structures that are worth our consideration. Last time we talked about arrays. On Monday, we talked about arrays. Today, I want to talk to you about array lists in Java versus lists in Python. What are some differences between using an array list in Java and using a Python list? Everything's an object. So an array list is in fact an object, but here's a question for you. Is a Python list an object? How would we know? It's a tricky question. How would we even know? Isn't everything in Python? Everything in Java is an object. That is a very famous rule. Everything in Python is not necessarily an object, but lists actually are objects in Python as well. So both array lists in Java and Python lists are objects. And if you're wondering how I'm so confident that lists in Python are objects, consider the way that we use them. I call methods on them. I call .append. That's one that we use a lot, right? So I'm calling a method on that list, just like I call a method on an object. Python lists are objects. Array lists in Java are also objects. Array lists in Java actually have an append method, I believe, right? So we can use an append method. What are some other methods that array lists do for us? I can remove stuff. I can add stuff. I can get the length, or is it the size? I always get the two confused. I think it's size, yeah. And so they feel very similar. There's one thing that we can do with Python lists that we can't do with array lists. Piece of syntax. I'm sorry? Different types of objects. So that's one, actually that's another one that I wasn't actually thinking of. But yeah, array lists, I have to declare what type they contain. What does that look like? How do I tell Java what? Pointy brackets are called angle brackets, but I like pointy brackets better. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. I did. They're called angle brackets. So I use angle brackets to tell Java what kind of stuff I'm expecting to put inside of that array list. Whereas with a Python list, I don't have to worry about that. I just throw in whatever I want to. There's another thing that we did a lot with Python lists that we can't do with array lists. Or we can do it with array lists, it just looks different, I guess, is a better way of explaining it. Yeah. I can't do an index. I can do indexing, right? But not with square brackets. I can't do square brackets. There's a method that I can call on a list that will allow me to specify what index that I want. And so in that sense, I can do the same kind of stuff that we're used to. I can loop through every single item on a list by index, or I can loop through every single item on a list by value. We saw both forms in Python. I can do the same thing in Java. Just looks a little bit different. I think we covered the major differences. Actually, array lists in Java and Python lists are very, very, very similar. The way that you access them is a little bit different, like we talked about, but probably the closest thing to a Python list would be an array list in Java. And then we have hash maps and dictionaries, Python dictionaries. So in what ways are these different? They're both intended to be the same kind of data structure, right? They're both intended to, what's a dictionary do for us, or a hash map do for us? Key value pairs. They both do key value pairs. So I give you a key, you give me back the value associated with that key. The way that we access keys is a little bit different though with hash maps, right? What do I have to do? I have to call a method, right? I have to call, I think it's .get. Or if I want to add something to a hash map, I have to call .put. Whereas with the Python dictionary, I would just do square brackets again. So kind of like what we saw with the lists. I can't use square brackets anymore. I got to call a method on the object. But otherwise, the two are very, very similar. And they're intended to be. They're intended to be very, very, very similar to one another. That's kind of the point I'm trying to make, actually, with all four of these concepts, is that Java can do everything that Python can do. It just looks a little bit different. We just access those things a little bit differently than we do with Python. And that'll trip you up. It trips me up. I don't know if you remember way back at the beginning, but when I first started writing Python with you guys way back in Unit 1, I was sticking semicolons on the end of everything. Why? Because I was used to writing in Java, right? And I switched over and I forgot. My brain just started putting those on there. That stuff will happen to you. You'll forget to put the parentheses after an if statement. You'll put a colon there instead, because that's what you're used to doing, right? It hasn't happened to you yet. It probably will. Java will get mad at you, and then it'll be like, oh yeah, this isn't Python anymore. We're doing Java now. That kind of stuff is going to happen. But the ideas, the behaviors, the actions that we're performing are still the same. They just look a little different. Before we do an exercise, anybody have any questions about any of these concepts? We're going to do a coding exercise next. Any questions? All right. I'm going to switch over to IntelliJ. You're welcome to open up IntelliJ and code along with me if you would like, or if you would not like, then just sit back and enjoy the show, I suppose. But let me introduce the exercise first. Actually, that's probably a good idea. I'm going to write a method that takes in two array lists of integers and adds them together. So when I say add them together, I gave you an example down here. This is my first array list, 3, 4, 5, 1. Here's my second array list, 1 and 6. So 3 plus 1 gets me 4, right? 4 plus 6 gets me 10. And then this list has run out of entries. They're not the same size. So 5 plus, I don't have anything to add, is 5. And then 1 plus, I don't have anything to add, is 1. Everybody kind of get the idea here? So let's switch over to IntelliJ. And I'm going to do something that I should have done on Monday, but yeah, question? Sure am, yeah. So I'm going to do something that I should have done on Monday, which is make a package for these exercises. My brain just forgot that step. So I see org.launchcode.java here. So I'm just going to right-click that and go to New Package. And I'm going to call it in-class. And all of our in-class stuff, at least for the first few weeks, is going to go here. And now I'm going to make a class to perform this particular exercise. We're working with array lists, so I'm not sure what I'll call it exactly yet. But I'll right-click this new package that I made and go to a new Java class here. And I don't know, we'll call it Arraylist Practice or something like that is fine. And here we are, a brand new class to start with. Give you a minute in case you're trying to set up your own class to start out with. If you didn't make the package and you want to just put it in a package you already have, that's fine. It's not a big deal. Just trying to keep my stuff a little bit organized. And so to review the problem again, right, we're going to write a method that takes in two array lists of ints. So let's just start with that part. I'm not even worried about how to add them together yet. Let's just make a method that takes in two array lists of integers. All right, so if I want to make a method, first thing I'm going to type is what? I'm sorry? It's visibility. So for our purposes, we're just going to use public for now. We're getting close to being able to talk about public versus private. That'll be coming up next week. But for now, we can just make things public. And then what comes next? Static. Again, next week we'll do some things that aren't static. But for this week, we're just going to keep things relatively static for now. What comes next? The return value. So what should, or actually the return type would be a better way of describing it, right? So if I'm taking in two array lists of integers and I'm adding them together, what do I expect my result to be? An array list of integers, right? I'm going to take two array lists of integers in, I'm going to combine them together into one array list of integers. So the way that I type that, array list Oh, wow, I didn't even have to do anything until they just automatically imported it for me. I didn't even ask it to do that. It just did it. It's still a little bit mad at me, though. What am I missing? I need the pointy brackets. Yeah, it's catching on. I need to specify what type of array list this is. Now, I'm going to put integer here, but actually last week we talked about not integer, but int. What's the difference? This is a primitive type, right? This is an object. Why have both? Why have both? Yeah.
I think the array list only take in objectified.
Yes, it can only operate with objectified types. That is correct. But even if we think about it in a more general sense, right, having an integer object kind of makes sense because everything else in Java is already an object, right? So having objects for our primitive types also kind of makes sense in that regard to allow us to treat our primitive types as objects in the cases that we need to, such as this case right here. All right, so I have the return type. What comes next? The method name, so I'll call it add lists. And then what comes next? Parentheses with the parameters. So it's going to take in 2 array lists of integers, right? So array list integer list 1, array list integer list 2. This is kind of a long line. I don't even think I can fit it all on the screen at one time, unfortunately, because the types are very long, but it's array lists all the way down. That is our method signature right there is what we would call that, method signature. Defines everything that goes into and comes out of this method. Okay? So now I have some actual work to do. I've got my method. I want to take these 2 array lists and do the act of adding them together, right? But there's a little bit of a wrinkle in there. I need to know which list is bigger, correct? I need to know which list is bigger because if I'm not careful, I'm going to run out of items and then I'm going to ask for an item that doesn't exist and then Java's going to get mad at me and nothing's going to work. So we need to be a little bit careful about that. What should we do first? Anybody have any ideas as to how to approach this? We could write a little bit of pseudocode here, right? What should I do first? All right, get the length of both lists. I like it. All right, then what? I'm sorry? All right. See which list is larger. Once I have that information, what do I do with it? So I hear, all right, a loop, a for loop. For what? For, I'm sorry? The larger list? Okay, so for each value in the larger list? In the smaller list? Okay.
Because you want to keep adding the 2 together until you use 1 out of them.
Okay.
And then you just want to list the ones that now.
Add values from both lists. So for each value in the smaller list, we're going to add values from both lists together, right? And then what? Are we done? But there's only one integer?
Well, like if you're taking it from a smaller list, then you're going to run out of spaces. You need to have where you're done with it.
So we'll need to deal with the extra values at the end of the longer list, right? Is that what you're getting at?
Right.
Right.
Since we're coming from the
So how do we do that? So another loop, right? for the remaining values in the longer list, add values, like, okay,
Well, just put those
copy,
values
yeah,
into
copy.
your new array.
Copy values, all right, cool. Ah, so we need a place to put all this stuff, right? Create new array list to hold our results. Create a new array list. Okay, are we good? Return results. There might be some other stuff in here that we struggle with or get stuck on as we go through, but I feel like this is a pretty good starting point for us, right? To try and figure out where we're going. Okay? So let's go back to the top and start knocking these out. First thing I want to do is just create a blank, empty array list that we can use to hold our results. Right? So how do I do that? What am I going to type? I'm sorry? Yeah, I have to give the type first, right? I'm declaring a variable, so I have to say what the type is. Arraylist integer results equals what? New arraylist integer semicolon? Oh, parentheses. Why parentheses? It's a method. It is. It's the constructor. You're absolutely right. We're calling the constructor the ArrayList constructor. We haven't actually gotten to the object-oriented stuff within Java yet. That's next week. But this is a constructor. We're calling an ArrayList constructor here. We're making a brand new ArrayList. That's why we need those parentheses on the end. That's also why we need this new keyword here as well, for the same reason. All right. The next thing says, get the length of both lists, see which list is longer, okay? So I can get the length of both lists. We can stick those into variables, right? The length is going to be what type? Int. So int length 1 equals, what did I call these again? List 1. List 1, and then I can hit dot, and you can see the methods that are here. Size is what I want. Okay, I'll do the same thing for length 2. This 2.size. And our next instruction says, see which list is larger. So what do I need to do that? An if statement. If length 1 is greater than length 2, then what do I do?
Then we know we want to use length 2 as our index.
So we want to use, so what are we actually deciding? We're deciding what exactly?
We need to figure out which one is the smaller list.
We need to figure out which one's the smaller list so that we know how often to run this loop, right? So what do I need to do to help me track this? There's a couple ways I could see this going. Make another variable. Okay. What?
You either make another variable in your array list, called a smaller array list, larger, or another variable.
I think you're right. I think I could. I need to have some way of tracking which list is the smaller one and which list is the larger one, right? So I can make variables for that. I can make a variable called smaller and a variable called larger, and assign those to the respective lists. Correct? That's okay. Or I could just use the lengths if I wanted to as well, right? I could make two integers, one called smaller and one called larger, and use the lengths. I mean, I think they'll both work, actually. I don't see an issue with either one. Well, or do I?
What if it's 100,000 log? What if it's 10 million log? You want to take up all that memory? We would need to know.
Take up what memory?
You want to store an additional variable?
Well, a variable's not going to be very long. It's either going to be an int or it's going to be.
Oh, and creating 2 additional lists.
But am I creating 2 additional lists though? What is this variable actually? List one, what is that? Is that the list? It's a reference. It's a reference to that list. So that this list is living somewhere in memory, right? And I have a variable that points to it. If I make another variable and I say you're the smaller list and you're the larger list, have I duplicated those lists? No, I have not. I've actually just created another reference pointing at those lists. It's just another label. It's just another signpost. Yes, the only time I create a new object in memory is when I call the constructor for an object. That's correct. Or if I create a deep copy. Yep. So we still haven't decided which one. I actually think that creating variables for the list is a little bit better. Yeah. I think if we just do the lengths, that this loop and this loop are going to be very difficult to write. I don't want to say that they'll be impossible, but I think they'll be more complicated than they need to be. I think if we make variables called larger and smaller and use them to point to the lists, that we'll have a little bit of an easier time with it. So here's what I like to do in this situation. I'm going to assume that list 1 is smaller than list 2. And then if I can prove that it's not, then I'll just swap them, right? I'll just swap the two. So I'm going to make an array list integer smaller equals list 1. Oops, not last one, list 1. Remember, I'm not creating a new list here. I'm creating a new reference to a list that I've already got. It's just another signpost pointing at the exact same list that I already have, right? Array list integer, I cannot spell today, larger equals list 2. And if I see these lengths, right, if length 1 is greater than length 2, that's an indication that I actually got these backwards, right? So I'll just switch them. I'll say larger equals list 1, smaller equals list 2. No matter what happens in this section of code, right, I think that by the time this section of code is done, smaller will be pointing at the smaller of the two lists, and larger will be pointing at the larger of the two lists. Do you agree with me on that? Or does anybody
In the case of, could they be actually equal? It
Oh,
wouldn't
yeah.
matter which one's larger.
Yeah, if they're actually equal, you're right. It makes, well, we kind of have to write our loops before we can definitively say that, but hopefully we'll write our loops in such a way that it does not matter if they are the same length. Yeah. If they're the same length, actually, which one would be which? Smaller would be list 1 and larger would be list 2 because this would be false, right? All right, cool. So now we've got a couple of loops to write. And we talked about the two different ways you can write for loops, correct? In Java. And I think this is actually a great time to experiment with both of those forms. This first loop we can easily write as which one? Iterating by index or by value? I could write it as by index, honestly, but I think it's a good time to actually write one by value because I'm touching every single value in the smaller list, right? Touching every single one. Although, actually, I kind of don't like that answer either, actually. I kind of want to do it by index now. Anyway.
You already know the length.
We already know the length, that's true. That's true. Although the length to me isn't really relevant anymore. Anyway, let's write it by index. So what's the first piece if I'm writing it by index? There's 3 parts, right? The first one is where to start. So what do I type to do that? I have to declare the I'm making a variable declaration here. Typically we call this variable I by convention, right? And a good starting place for it is 0 because lists and arrays all start with index 0, correct? All right, the next thing is what? The condition. So when do I want to stop? It's a little misleading, actually. It's like, when do I want to keep going, right? Size minus 1? Be a little careful with that one. I less than, so I could use the variable here if I wanted to, but I don't know which one is which. I don't know which one is which, but I can use smaller dot size. And actually, gosh, I butchered that in 3 different ways. I don't need a minus 1 here. Don't need a minus 1 here. Up to, but not including that value, right? That's actually similar to what Python did for us when we use the range function. Up to, but not including that value. Up to, but not including. And then what do I put for the last piece? I++. Just increase it by 1 each time through the loop. All right. And now it simply says add values from both lists. So remember that we have this new list up top that we created called results, correct? So I'm going to add a value from both lists together and put it in that results one. So how do I do that? What should I do? You could do this all in one line. I think it might be a little bit more straightforward, or a little bit easier for us to digest, rather, if we break it up into 2 lines, even though we could technically do it all in one line if we wanted to. So what should I do? Let's get the sum and stick it in a variable, right? Let's get the sum of the 2 values and put it in a variable. So the type of that variable is going to be an int. Sum equals, so how do I get the values that I want from my lists? Dot index of, all right. So smaller index of, actually, so index of here, it says it's taking an object. Is that what I have? I want to use .get. .get is looking for an index, an int index, which we have. Our index is I plus larger. So this will grab 2 values out of each list, add them together, stick them in a variable. And then we need to make sure that it makes it into our result, right? So how do I do that? Results dot, and then I see add here. I think there is an append as well, is there not? Maybe there isn't. Maybe there isn't. I thought there was, but that's okay. Add sum. Are there any questions on this one? We're almost done. It says we just need to take the remaining values from the longer list and copy them over. So I'm done doing addition at this point. I just need to copy those values from the longer list over. This is another loop. So where do we start this time? This is the tricky part.
You take larger minus smaller.
Larger minus, that's the total number, right? Larger minus smaller. But we have to remember that it's not just how many that I have, but also where in the list they appear that matters to us, right? Because if I know that I need 3 elements, I can't just take the first 3. I actually need to take the last 3 elements.
But you need to know how many elements to get.
I do need to know how many there are to get, yeah. But remember, what Java's asking us for here is, where do I start?
Oh.
Yeah. Smaller dot size is where I start, right? No, I think it'd just be smaller dot size. Because if the smaller list had 3 elements in it, the size would be 3, right? The index of the last element would be 2. Yeah, so 3 would be the right place to start. So int I equals smaller dot size. All right. Where do I stop? Larger dot size. And then I++. And now I just need to copy values. This one I think we can do all in one line if we want to. What's the value that I want to get out? larger.get I, and what do I want to do with that value?
Add it to the sum, results.
Results dot add. If you wanted to break this into 2 lines just to make it clear that you're getting one value from one list and then putting it in the other, I have no problem with that, right? But this is okay too, the way that we've written it. And then this works. Return results. All right, we covered a lot of ground here. I'm not quite done yet. I want to test this thing and make sure that it works. So I got to make some lists, and I got to put some actual values in those lists, right? And then I have to pass them into this method and see. Where am I going to do that? Main. All right, let's make a main method. We covered this last time. So I want to make an array list. Yeah, what's up?
The parameters are passed to the always going to be a strict array number.
Yes, it is always going to be. In fact, if you don't have this in here, you see those green triangles disappear? It's not a properly defined main method, and Java's not going to know that that's what you want to be your main method. If you ever think you have a main method, but it's not, your code's not running, that's almost always why, because you've left out the parameter or you haven't declared the main method in exactly this way. It has to look exactly like this every single time. Yep. All right, so I want to create some array. Let's just do the example from the slides, yeah? Let's just do this one. I want to make one list that's got 3, 4, 5, and 1. Another list that has 1 and 6. Okay, so we've already seen how to make array lists. I can see it right here, right? New array list integer. Oops, 2 equal signs, my fault. That's supposed to be an L and a 1, but that was a poor choice because they don't look very much different, do they? First. And then I just want to add those values. So first dot add, what was it, 3, 4, 6, 1? Is that what it was? 3, 4, 5, 1, close. 3, 4, 5.
You can somehow combine that together into one statement.
Could I combine this together into one statement? You might be able to chain them together. Well, let me do this. No, it won't let me do that. Oh, I can make an array and then pass the array in. Yeah. Yeah. My fingers are getting tired, so I'm just going to copy this code and change it a little bit for the next list because I'm getting tired of typing this stuff out. In fact, if you look up people's least favorite things about Java online, which maybe you have, maybe you haven't, one of them is that you have to type a lot of stuff to get things going. I don't know if you've noticed that. Getting a program up and running in Java requires a lot more code than in Python. That's just a fact. 1 and 6, all right. 1 and 6. Oh, I do. Thank you. I almost missed that. All right. Now I want to call my method, right? So my method is called add lists, and then I'll put in first and second. And then how do I see the result? I got to grab the return value and put it in a variable, right? Arraylist answer. And then how do I print out the results? Answer. All right. We have typed a lot of code, right? We have typed a lot of stuff out. Let's let's cross our fingers and hope that we get what we expect, which is 4, 10, 5, and 1. That's what we expect to get if things are working properly. So let's give it a go. Click the green triangle here and see what IntelliJ has to tell us. 4, 10, 5, 1. Looks good. I will post this code on Slack once we're done with our lecture, so you can refer back to it later if you would like to. Actually, I just thought of one more thing, right? If we really want to test our code, we should do a couple things. We should make sure that the length stuff is doing its job properly, right? And so what if I switch the order of these? If I switch the order of these lists, I should get the same thing, right? I should get exactly the same thing. That's how I would know that it's working properly. I now have the smaller list first and the larger list second. Should get the same thing, and I do. And then if I really wanted to test it, I'd make two lists that are the same size and make sure that that works as well. If my lists are the same size, how many times is this loop going to run? 0, hopefully. In fact, if we think about it, right, if they're the same size, that means smaller dot size and larger dot size are the same. So I equals some number. That number is less than the same number. That's not true. It's equal to, which is not less than, and so the loop's not even going to run, not even once. Right? Which is good. That's what we want. That's what we want. What questions do you have about this example?
I have a question.
Yeah, what's up?
And my memory might not serve as well, but I feel like at some point I've seen examples of like when we say new Arraylist and call it structure. I feel like I've seen it to where they didn't put integer in there. They only did it in the initial declaration. I feel like.
Yeah, and you can see that.
They still had the angle brackets, but it was just.
Oh, they still had the angle brackets, but they left it empty?
Yeah.
Interesting. I'm not surprised that you saw that. In fact, this has been a point of contention with Java over the years. Some versions of Java, you can see actually I'm taking the angle brackets out entirely, and nobody's complaining to me right now. Nobody's getting upset.
Yeah, but does it automatically think it's an integer or?
Still runs, yeah. And so this is something that has been, I personally find confusing about Java, are the rules about typing your collections. Some versions of Java were very strict about it, said you have to do this. It's non-negotiable. Got to put it here. Other versions of Java were like, I'll figure it out, right? You don't necessarily need to tell me what the type of the thing is. And so the rules on that have been changing over time, basically, is what it boils down to. And which rule you have to follow depends on which version of Java you're currently using. This version of Java, which is Java 8, I believe, is being a little bit forgiving. Now, I still think that in some cases, maybe not necessarily all cases, but in a lot of cases, it's probably still in your best interest to put the type here, especially if, so in this case, if you left this integer off, I'm not going to be too upset, because if I look at this, that's an integer. I know what that is, right? But if I'm putting something else here and it's not immediately obvious to me what that thing is, then I would much prefer to see what the type of that thing is in angle brackets, because that's more information for me, right?
What if you put in like 3 and then you put in 4.0 and you didn't declare integer?
Well, let me do that. Even if I do declare integer, right? This is a double, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I can't mix the two.
Okay.
Whether I tell it that there's an integer or not, it won't let me mix those two.
So it'll make it whatever the first value is.
It'll make it whatever the first value you add is.
Okay.
Yeah. But again, depending on what version of Java you use, that may or may not be true. You're going to see me put the angle brackets here every time. Partly just, and honestly, part of that is just because when I learned it, that's what I did, right? That's how I did it.
Most of the examples I saw had it on the left side and on the right side left down. That kind of makes sense to me because this is set.
Well, you can see IntelliJ is telling me here, explicit type argument integer can be replaced with bracket bracket.
Oh,
It's actually telling me that. Such bracket syntax is not supported under Java 1.6 or earlier. Actually, Java 1.6, I think, is what I learned when I first started doing Java, which tells you something. Or actually, I was even earlier than that, maybe 4 or 5. But anyway, so some of this is my old habits refusing to die, and I'm not going to apologize for that. You know, that's just what it is. Vintage, yeah, vintage Java, going way back to 2006. That's right.
Scroll down.
Yeah, happy to. To the method?
Where you call the method.
Oh, to where I called the method. Yeah, right here. And there are some other simplifications that could be made on this code, right? I went out of my way to type some extra stuff out that didn't necessarily need to be typed out, just so we could see the full picture of what's going on. But if you really wanted to tighten this code up, there's definitely some room for doing that here. So that might be a good thing for you to think about if you got some extra time today. What other questions do you have right now? Yeah, notice I didn't use any hash maps today, but you'll get a full dose of that in your studio. So you'll be using hash maps for studio today, which we will be taking a look at around our normal time of 8 o'clock. So unless there are any more questions, we'll go ahead and break up into our studio groups, and I'll see you in about an hour and a half. Thanks, everybody.